Hello again, this is Eric with Auburn AV, and we're continuing our video series on LSC Clarity. I'm doing this video just to talk about the record button. You can find the record button under Programmer and Palettes, right there. And how this all works is, let's say, I've already built out something here for time's sake, and let's just say that this look here is something we like and we want to keep it and use it in our show. So we want to save it to a cue. So we hit the record button and this screen pops up here and you'll see it says new cue list. If you want to add it to an existing cue list or a cue list that you've already started, then you could hit this button and select it here. You can name it, so we're going to name it test cue. And then if this button here, if you want to hit reset, you can reset all these attributes just by hitting reset. It resets it to the default. And everything on here is that we see is at the default for if you hit record. If you're building a bunch of the same cues, like you're building a bunch of light, say color cues, and you want everything to be where it's just you're writing color, and you want to have it be the same every time, and you don't want this to come to default, then once you got all your settings in here the way you want them, you can hit this keep settings button and it'll keep those settings until you're done making the series of cues. So if you're making a cue that's all just colors so that you can change colors with some cues, then and you don't want to, and you want it to be the same every single time, then you don't have to keep, it's a shortcut, you don't have to keep changing all of these attributes that we're about to go over. You can hit keep settings, and when it's darkened it's keeping, and if you change something you can just unclick it and click it back and it keeps it as what you've newly selected. This section here is for mode, so if you save a cue you can save it as a tracking cue or as a cue only. The tracking cue, the way this works is, let's say you're doing the color cue and you've got everything on stage going and you just want the color information to change and you want everything else that is live to continue doing what it was already doing. That's why you would use the tracking. If you want it to be a type of cue where it cancels out everything else that's going on stage and it's only what's in this specific cue, then you can do the mode as cue only, and then when you hit go on that cue, everything else stops doing what it's doing. It crossfades or however you have it set to move to what this cue is telling everything to do. You can use this for active fade in times, that's based on seconds, fade out time, or release fade. This button here makes it where this would be highest intensity or highest level takes priority. Clicked off, it would be set on the priorities that you have set here. This is the chase mode, so if you're building a cue stack and you want them to chase, you can have them set to where it goes from cue to cue forwards, cue to cue from the back to the front, bounce around, or random. This right here is your chase rate. You can increase or decrease the speed at which the chase is moving. And this is the crossfade, so you can increase or decrease the amount of fade between cues. You can do a tempo set to where you can lock it to a specific tempo. The first line, as it says here, is bars and then beats. Priority is important to use, so if you have some submasters like intensity cues set to a fader and you want those to always, you want all of your lights to take the intensity from that, then you have it set as a higher priority. So this one here, maybe we don't want the intensity to really affect this cue that we have. We want it to stay on our submaster fader that we made for all our light intensities. You'd have it at a normal, and that master fader or sub fader that you created would have a high priority. That way this intensity here would take from the higher priorities intensity if they're trying to operate the same channel on that fixture. The one set to the higher priority, which would be your sub fader, would take over, and your intensity would go up and down based on that. Here you have several options that you can make this cue take over. A lot of this is used for if you're using a controller or faders inside of the control booth up here. Release at the end is if you have a chase or queue stack that's set and you want it to stop once it gets through all of your queues and go black, you'd hit the release at the end of that. This one, it comes set as loop at the end because normally people want to create a chase or an intensity and they want it to stay on, and so this just loops it so it always keeps going through your chase. If it's only one queue, then that one queue just stays on all the time. Go on fader up. If you're using it, if you want this to be controlled by a fader, you can have the queues start when you hit fader up, and then you have the queue release when the fader is turned all the way down, and it releases the queue in your control booth. Release on pause playback is if your controller has a pause playback button, you can have that button release the queue. You can make it where the action button on your controller will toggle go and release. You can also have it where the action button acts as a flash, which would be the opposite of toggle. So if you're holding down the action button, then the queue will be running, and as soon as you let go of that, then it releases the queue. Release when fully overridden, which means if you override it, all aspects of this queue is overridden, and it will release it. You can have it ignore release all and ignore grand master. You would use these two if you're trying to park a light, say you're trying to backlight or light up a banner or something that always needs to be on no matter what you're doing in your show. Then you could have it ignore release all and ignore the grand master, and that light is always on even when you black out or hit the release all button. That this queue will stay on all the time. It says release intensity first, which means it'll release the intensity and start dimming out before it releases everything else in your queue, the other like position, color, and beam. Fader affects all attributes. You can use this to have, normally when you set it to faders, the fader just affects the intensity of the queue. Fader affects all attributes means that it would affect every attribute that's selected that you're using in your queue. You would use that at, say you have a wheel that just does the gobo spin, and you want to be able to change the rate of a gobo spin all the time, or on the fly, and you want to assign that to a fader. You could build out a queue that just has the gobo spin turned all the way up, and click on fader affects all attributes, and then save the queue and have none of these other ones selected. And what it'll do is you can speed up and down. It'll make the fader control that channel. Essentially is what it makes it do, instead of just controlling the intensity up and down. You can have it restart from the last active queue, and then you have a solo on flash and solo save. Over here you have some queue options. You can have, this would be queue number 1 in your new queue list, and the name of the queue, you can rename each queue within the queue list. So I have the test queue, and if you have test queue and you say you have a set of queues and it's a color chase, you can have this be red, blue, green, whatever color this chase is doing. You can have it insert into a queue list. You can have it merge with a queue list. You can have it replace a queue. You can have it remove the queue. Queue only changes revert on next queue, which means if you click that and this is a queue only, then when you go to the next queue, it reverts back to whatever it was prior to when you hit that queue only queue. This here would be delay time and a fade in time. These they don't show it in here, but these have a 2-second preset on it, and if you don't want that, you have to go in here and hit 0 for each one. I don't know why they do that, but that's the way it is on this software. And so when I'm programming, even when you do this keep settings, I still have to do this. That might be something that we would suggest that they change in the future, or maybe I'm just doing it wrong and don't understand. But every time I make a queue and I don't want this to have the 2 seconds, you have to remember to change that in here, because this keep settings doesn't seem to affect these two. It affects everything else, but it doesn't seem to affect those two. I'm not sure why. That's just kind of how it is. Let's say, for example, if you're creating a queue and you built out this queue, but you only want to save the color portion of it to a queue or a queue list. You can deselect these, and it'll only write the information in that component for the content of it. You can hit where it uses the selected fixtures only, whereas if you don't have that checked, it looks at what the DMX signal is outputting altogether. You can exclude fixtures at 0%, which means any fixtures that aren't being used, it doesn't write the information for those. You can it comes in here with says exclude redundant state changes, which means if you're overwriting something that's already going on. It just excludes that change because it's redundant. You can include unchanged information, blocking incoming fixtures only, and blocking all fixtures. Down here you've got your queue. You can go to make it create a group, a preset, active queue preset, page bookmark, clear recorded values. You can cancel, and then when you hit this button, when you've got all these aspects here how you want them, then you can hit record, and it writes your queue and throws it over here into our control booth in our queue list here. For lack of, I don't really know what this section's called, but it's a list of all of your queue lists. So you can scroll through here and select these and get to them here. If you made a mistake in the last one, you want to change something, you have all of your, you can change it to a tracking queue or a queue only here. You can change it to a chase. You can change the priority. This right here would make the queue list start. You see it start there. And release. So you can start and release these queues here. But that gives you an idea of how the recording button works and all the parts inside of it. That's a fairly detailed section that needs a little running over and kind of definitions of what all the buttons and aspects of this button do. I hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you.